Everyone, and welcome to the Spark Talks webinar series. I hope everyone is online and tuned in. We're here today to listen to a presentation by Nisha Sajnani, who will be talking about the relationship between the arts, trauma, and health. And I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Elvira Trulia, the engagement coordinator for the Light a Spark campaign. And this webinar series is brought to you today by the Light a Spark campaign. And before Nisha gets into her presentation, I wanted to briefly introduce you to the Girls Action Foundation. As I know some of you may not be familiar with our work, and for those who are, I thank you for your patience. So the Girls Action Foundation is a nonprofit that works to empower girls across Canada. We're based in Montreal, where we run local girls programs, and we work with approximately 240 partners nationwide who run local programs in their communities. And some of the things we do include provide leadership training to young women, as well as organize networking events and other gatherings to connect girls and young women. In terms of impact, we reach about 60,000 girls and young women communities and marginalized and urban communities across the country, including those in the north. And I have to say that in many ways, the Action Foundation uses the principles and practices that Nisha will be talking about today. So I wanted to just give you a really quick glance at the Light a Spark campaign that is, again, presenting the webinar series. It's a campaign that launched on March 8th, and we're actually very close to the end of the campaign. And the goal of the campaign has been to build a movement to inspire girls and young women to achieve their potential. It's a lofty goal, and we're trying to do this by showcasing women who have broken new ground all across the country. And these role models, or what we call sparks, have all accepted to get involved in many different ways, including presenting webinars or writing blogs and many more things. And Nisha is from Canada, even though currently, as you'll hear in a moment, she lives in New Haven, Connecticut. So right before passing things on to Nisha, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of today's agenda. So you'll see on your screen a series of panels on the right-hand side, and these information displays and slides will be changing throughout the presentation. And you'll see one of the panels on the lower right-hand side of your screen is called Chat, and here's where you can ask questions and interact with Nisha, myself, as well as other participants. So I invite you to, if you have questions throughout the session or comments during the presentation, to type those into the chat box and hit Enter after you've typed in your question. And these questions will be recorded, and by default, they're going to be visible to everyone participating in the webinar. You might want to instead choose to submit a question privately, and so what you can do is press on the right-hand arrow key, and you can select send to the host and presenter, or send to the host, and that question, and actually my name should appear on your screen, and I will get that question directed to my side of the screen. And I do invite you to send me your questions, because after Nisha has spoken, we'll be opening up the question and answer period to answer the questions. And as the moderator, I'll be keeping track of everything that has been asked in the chat box and directing those questions to Nisha during the question period. I also want to let you know that today's webinar is being recorded, including the question period, and they will and the whole presentation will be posted online in the next few days. And I'll send everyone a link to the recording. A last technical note before getting things rolling is to let you know that Nisha is on webcam, so you should automatically see her on your video panel on the right-hand side of your screen. In case you don't, what you want to do is click on the right-hand arrow key on the round series of panels and select the video panel, and there you should see a little window that appears, and with Nisha's name appearing as well, and you click on her name and you should be able to see her smiling face. The last thing I wanted to do is actually introduce Nisha. I know some of you may already know her, but I do have the privilege of introducing Dr. Nisha Sajnani today. She's a registered drama therapist and is the director of Creative Alternatives, which in her own words is a network of social innovators whose work deepens the relationship between creativity and interdependence. Nisha designed this network as a learning platform for using theater and improvisation to examine social policy issues such as racism, poverty, immigration, and many, many other social issues. Nisha has extensive experience with arts-based and collaborative approaches to group learning and inquiry, and brings expertise in trauma and its effects on human systems. She's the director of the Drama Therapy, Community Health, and Prevention Program at the Post-Traumatic Stress Center in New Haven, and that's located in Connecticut, mentioned earlier, and she's the president-elect of the National Association for Drama Therapy. So I'm going to pass things over to Nisha right now. Nisha.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Elvira. I'm really excited to be part of the webinar and excited to share a few ideas on how the arts might respond to trauma and create conditions for health and healing. I'm just going to flip over here to my presentation. Just a minute.
You can just go to the very top, Nisha.
Let's see here. Okay, I'm going to trust that everybody can see that first slide. So before we begin, I'm going to mention, and if you were watching me just scroll back through all of the slides, you may have noticed that many of the slides are a bit word-heavy. And so while you might be tempted to read them as I'm going along, that's really a natural thing to do as you're listening and as you're presented with a lot of information in front of you. I'll mention that I've left it this way so that you can come back to the webinar as a resource. So I'll be speaking through the slides. I may not cover everything that's on them, and I may click through them quicker than you have a chance to read. So again, you may return to it after if there are specific moments in this presentation that you want to take a little bit more time with. Before we get into trauma, I'm going to actually start us off with a clip from Eve Ensler's film Until the Violence Stops, which is a documentary about the V-Day movement, which emerged from a play she wrote called The Vagina Monologues, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. We'll watch the clip until about 1:18, and I'll cue you. I'll let you know when to stop. The entire trailer is actually about 5 minutes long, and I'll encourage you to go back to the trailer later. There's a lot of interesting information as to how the movement began and where it's gone to, but for just our purposes today, we'll watch about 1:18. So you should see a tab that says Watch in your screen, and the video might start automatically. If it doesn't, press play.
So in 1997, we got a group of women together in New York, and I said, how could we use the vagina monologue to stop violence against women and to serve this? And we came up with the idea of V-Day.
If your vagina could talk, what would it say? Tell me! Say it! This is a rape-free zone! The way V-Day works is that people produce the vagina monologues in their own country, in their own language. They put on the shows, and then they give the money to local groups to stop the violence. Tonight, we begin to heal all the women of Harlem, as well as all the women of the world. Free, got free, got free, got free.
What we realized, V-Day could in fact be a worldwide movement.
All right, I'm actually going to ask you to stop right about now. Just wait, and people may have pressed play a little bit later. Let's wait a couple seconds, and we'll go back to the presentation. I started with this particular clip because I think Ensler's work really embodies the relationship between the arts and, in this case, documentary theater and film. So I think her work really embodies the relationship between the arts, trauma, and health. She begins with a collection of interviews, which she's done with a diverse group of women around the world. She puts them into short, sharp monologues and performs them for wide audiences. She also draws on high-profile guests to kick off a movement, and then later leaves that movement open so that others around the world can come close to it, develop their own productions, and of course the funds raised from each performance go to organizations working to end violence against women. There are critiques against her work, definitely, but I did want to start off with this because I think it really brings together some of the themes that I'll be speaking about over the next 20-25 minutes. So for the rest of this presentation, I'd like to start with some information about trauma, how we think about trauma, what are some definitions for trauma, what is the impact and effect of trauma, and then taking a look at how can we situate art or the arts as a response to trauma, or what I put here is as a call and a response to trauma, and I'll get more into that a little bit later. I'd like to share with you a few examples of trauma-informed arts practice in community environments and in clinical environments, and then share with you some of the questions that have arisen from my own practice and also open it up to a conversation with all of you. Getting right into trauma, there are two definitions that often come up. There's the word trauma, which comes from the Greek meaning wound, and that refers to, as you can see there on your screen, an emotional, psychological, or physical injury that causes pain or suffering. And you can compare that with the definition that's used by the DSM-4, which is the statistical manual that's used in mental health practice, where trauma refers to an experience that either one experiences or one witnesses or is confronted with that poses a serious threat to one's physical integrity, either their own integrity or the integrity of others, and that comes with an experience of deep fear or horror, often calling up feelings of helplessness or hopelessness. Trauma can be acute, it can be a single event, or it can be chronic, something that happens over time. So I'll share with you a few different examples of trauma, and these next few lists are by no means exhaustive, but they're intended to give you a sense of the wide scope of what I'm referring to. So here are some examples of what some individuals and groups have found traumatic. It's important to remember, of course, that two individuals who go through the same event might not experience it in the same way. So two people driving a car that get into a car accident, the driver, for example, might feel that sense of helplessness or hopelessness, might have felt a loss of control, might have felt terrified, and the passengers may have felt less so. Both of them are going to experience the effects of that accident differently. Here are a few more examples of trauma. I'd like to highlight here that trauma is a relational experience. It doesn't necessarily mean that each traumatic event happens between people. For example, people that went through Hurricane Katrina, they went through a natural disaster, but trauma is still relational in the sense that what people sometimes
Nisha,
feel
if I could just interrupt for a second. Sorry to interrupt you. It's just a lot of people were letting me know that the video was actually still running for the last couple of minutes, and a lot of people weren't able to actually hear you. So I've closed down the video, so now people can hear you, but you might want to just really quickly recap.
Sure. I'm sorry about that. So we will figure out this technology. So a quick recap. I was going through the outline of what we're going to be speaking about or thinking about together, looking at trauma and its effects, looking at art as a response to trauma, looking at a few examples. I'd gone over the definition of trauma, so trauma being a wound that affects a person emotionally, psychologically, physically. I would also argue spiritually. The DSM will define trauma as an experience that also comes with an intense experience of helplessness or hopelessness. And then we were moving into examples of trauma. And I'm just saying that trauma is a relational experience. So giving the example of Hurricane Katrina, people that went through that storm definitely affected by the hurricane, but if you'll remember from the news, so many of them were much more affected by aftermath and the great disappointment that they faced or the helplessness they may have faced as they waited for aid from the American government, aid that came very, very late. So trauma is a relational experience. Trauma also involves a failure of some kind, whether it's a failure to attend it might involve failure of others to respond while somebody's going through pain. It might involve a failure of a parent to a child, of police to somebody who's in need, if they don't arrive in time. So it involves a kind of failure of some sort, and it is relational. So let's move on a little bit. So what I highlight here in this slide is that trauma can also be collective and intergenerational. It doesn't necessarily affect just one person. Violence against women is more of an epidemic, for example. So sexism can affect, of course, a great number of people. So trauma can be collective. Large groups of people can be affected by the same sort of situation. And if you'll remember, I was mentioning that trauma can be acute or chronic. So racism, sexism, homophobia, poverty, many of these things are chronic, often low-lying traumas. They're not always low-lying. Certainly there can be acute, sort of over-the-top examples of racist encounters. But otherwise, what I'm referring to here is sort of the context in which people live. A story that I sometimes like to use to describe collective trauma goes a little like this. There are two fishes. They're swimming along. They come along a larger fish. The larger fish says to them, "Boys, how's the water?" And the two fish sort of shrug and swim off. And as they're swimming off, one fish to the other and says, "What the heck, water?" I hope you know that story. I can't really hear your reaction, so I'm just going to trust that you did. But it's essentially that. It's the water that we're swimming in, and that water can sometimes breed. It can sometimes create an experience of helplessness or hopelessness to learn to adapt to, but that still isn't pleasant. Here we go. Okay. So to recap a little bit, trauma is an event. It's something that happens, whether it happens once or it happens over time. It produces an experience of fear, of helplessness or hopelessness, and it significantly affects our beliefs about ourselves, about others, and about the world. Most significantly, trauma shakes our sense of safety. It messes with our sense of meaning-making. It results in an experience of failure and disconnection. Disconnection, or that feeling of separation from oneself or from others, is something that's often reported when people go through events like this or experiences like this. Severity and the extent of the symptoms that people feel, depending on their age, depending on a number of different factors, on the presence or absence of social supports, whether it's work, faith, school, whether they're plugged into particular social supports that can help them navigate the impact of trauma. It'll vary depending on whether they've gone through difficult things in the past and whether they are inclined to adapt to what's happening, or whether they have been rendered more vulnerable because of experiences they've had already. Here are a few of the symptoms that people can experience. I'm using the word symptoms. It's a really sort of jargony, medicalized word. And what I really want to emphasize here is that when somebody goes through a traumatic experience, another way of thinking about it is that it's an experience that overwhelms the human condition. It's an abnormal experience. It's not something that we expect or that we want or that we would choose. And as a result, all of our reactions are normal. They are normal reactions in the face of an abnormal circumstance. So you'll notice there are a lot of difficult things that people might experience, and a lot of these symptoms might make a person feel really off, or sometimes, to use the word crazy, it might create a sense of real disequilibrium in individuals or groups. And it's really important to remember that these sorts of reactions are very normal in the face of of the achy experience that somebody has gone through. Now, that said, if these sorts of symptoms persist over time for a month, for several months, for a year, then it can become a real problem. It can get in the way of an individual or a group charting out their goals, reaching their desires, and entering into the kind of relationships that they would like to. And that's when more professional help is often indicated. So today I'll be speaking a little bit about community-based interventions and clinical interventions. the arts and community and the arts and therapy, or the arts as therapy. And I really want to differentiate the two because both can be called for depending on what one is up against and how intrusive these symptoms can be. So I sort of debated a little bit along this slide. I'd first called it positive outcomes of experiencing or witnessing trauma, and it's not so much that I'm looking for the silver lining in trauma because, everything that I've mentioned or every example of trauma that I've given are experiences that we hope that no one will ever have, but they do, and people do go through suffering. So what I'm indicating here is that there are some individuals who've taken that experience and said, okay, what am I going to do with it? In what way can I try to gain control back? In what way can I use this experience to educate or collaborate with others so that I can work against the kinds of situations or the kinds of suffering that people are going through? So I've got 3 examples here. There's MAD, which is a very well-known organization, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, Jane Doe No More, and the Girls Action Foundation. So in each of these cases, you have an individual or a group of individuals who have either experienced trauma or they've witnessed it happening in society or in their communities, and they've decided to organize around it. There are a number of different ways in which community organizers, artists, educators, and clinicians respond to trauma, and while all of the different approaches might differ in name and in the ways that they're described, these are some very common characteristics of responses to trauma that I've organized into an acronym that I'm calling ARISE. So starting with acknowledging the effects of harm, people don't often work towards preventing suffering or responding to suffering unless they see it as a problem. If we don't think it's broken, we're not going to really try to fix it. So acknowledging the effects of harm. I find that harm has been done. That's all under acknowledging. Recognizing the sources of harm. This is a really important one because sometimes work that is done around trauma is about alleviating symptoms. It's about alleviating suffering so that a person can go back to functioning in their world. But often interventions can draw focus away from who is actually causing the harm or what's actually causing the harm, what people, what policies, what programs, what practices. And it can be very empowering and a very, very important part of the healing process to work towards justice, to work towards regulating those situations that produce harmful experiences in the first place. And those 3 organizations that I had mentioned in the previous slide are trying to do just that. So find culturally specific perspectives on illness and health and healing. Not everybody thinks about health and illness in the same way. And each group of people, each community is going to have their own way of mourning. And I think about a colleague of mine who recently lost someone. She's has a strong Jewish background, and she described to me how people would sit together for about 7 days. I think she called it sitting shiv. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact name that she used, but that people would sit together for 7 days while their neighbors and their friends would come by with food and would come by with what, hold on a second, seeing a little sign on my computer that says I'm disconnected.
You're here, Nisha. Just
Am I there? Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you. But we can't see the slide that you're on, though, if you want to just switch to the next slide.
Sure. So I'm sorry, we're facing a little technical difficulty here because, Elvira, I'm not able to see the slide either. It seems to have disconnected from the screen. Are you able to see? You're not able to see the slide either, hey?
No, people are basically seeing the last slide that you were on, the generative outcomes of experiencing or witnessing trauma.
Right, okay.
People can hear you, though. So people can hear you. So what I suggest is to just people are in audio broadcast, so that's okay.
Okay. So continue. I mean, we won't be able to see pictures of pics, but that's all right. I can always include those or send those to Elvira, who can make them available. Would that be all right, Elvira?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So then, we'll work with what we have. All right. So was talking about Arise, talking about identifying culturally specific approaches to, or culturally based definitions of health, of illness. The S stands for support. I'm sure many of you have heard the word resilience being bandied about. And I have a lot of different thoughts around the word resilience. I mean, often people will say, two people will go through the same kind of experience, and one might come out of it unharmed and unscathed and unwounded, while another continues to deal with depressive symptoms, anxious symptoms, worry, isolation, withdrawal, what have you. And often people will chalk that up to, the first person must have just been more resilient, which isn't. To me, it's sort of an incomplete analysis, because it sort of suggests that the first person had, either was not as weak as the second, or just wasn't as vulnerable, which may certainly be the case. But I think it's an incomplete analysis, because often what really makes a difference is the presence of social supports, the absence or presence of social strengths that a person has in their life that can help them get through a traumatic experience. It's not all about their internal or individual resilience. And the E is finally for expression, and it's how do I express and how do I communicate experiences that I've gone through that don't make sense to me? Trauma, by its very nature, is senseless. It's not something that should have happened, that you wanted to have happen, or that you would have chosen to have happen. And it's, sometimes I tell the story of, it's a little bit like, imagine you've got a pad of paper and you've got your favorite pen or pencil, and you're writing your life story, and all of a sudden somebody elbows you out of the way, grabs your pen, and starts writing. And when you finally get your pen back and you finally get your pad of paper back, it's messy, and on top of it there's this scrawl, or there's this paragraph written in your story. You didn't choose it, you didn't want it, now you've got to negotiate it. Another word I use for this is it's a forced accommodation. Trauma is a forced accommodation that you suddenly have to wrap your head around, wrap your spirit around, wrap your mind around in order to make sense of it. So it's hard to make sense of. So the E is for being able to find ways of expressing this experience so that you can come back into relationship with others who may not have gone through it. I see a lot of Vietnam veterans at the clinic where I work, and they will, even if they're all sitting in a circle in the same group, each one of them will talk about how nobody will understand. Nobody can understand what they've been through. And we try to counter that by providing a group experience, but that doesn't always help, because the experience of disconnection is so pervasive and runs so deep. So unfortunately, I can't click through the next slide, but the next question I wanted to ask you is, and we'll do this as we get into conversation, but I wonder if the arts can facilitate any of these goals that I've mentioned in Arise. Whether they can facilitate acknowledging sources of harm, or acknowledging the effects of harm, recognizing the sources of harm, identifying strengths and culturally specific definitions, whether they can inspire or support social networks, and whether they can facilitate expression. And I'm biased. I definitely believe that the arts can, but how they do it, and under what ethics and through what forms, we'll get into in a minute. So Elvira, I'm guessing that we're not able to do a poll at this point, right?
No.
Okay. We'd initially designed a poll just so that I could get a sense of where each of you were coming from in terms of your practice, whether you were coming at this conversation as a clinician, as somebody working in community, or both, whether you've used the arts before in your work, whether you're planning to.
Nisha, we could do it via the chat box. We can ask general questions, and people can just give us a real general sense of the areas where they.
What I think I prefer is I'll continue through this a little bit, and then we'll open it up to a conversation at the end, and I love to hear about people's experiences and questions that have come up for them. But I'll keep going just for a little bit longer. So key arts facilitate Arise, for short. By the arts, I'm referring to both the art that you will see hanging in a popular museum, the films that make it to the main screen, and the theater that you will see on Broadway. And I'm also referring to the arts that we create ourselves, the use of image, of sound, of movement, of text, to be able to create symbols and metaphors of our experience and to communicate ourselves in the world, to express ourselves in the world. So the way that I see it is that the arts can serve as a call to action, a memorial. The arts can serve as a vehicle for mourning, for grieving losses, and arts can bear witness to what individuals and what communities go through. There are a number of different projects that I'd like to highlight. V-Day was one of them. That's one social movement and one project that's really taken flight. There are a couple projects that I'm involved with locally. One I participated in just last week was at a local high school here in New Haven. New Haven youth, often African-American Hispanic youth here in New Haven, experience a lot of losses, especially in the summertime, and that's because gun violence goes up at least 200%, and they lose 3 or 4 of their peers easily in the summer. A lot more people are out, and of course, you know, as the story goes, you'll see that a death of a young person in New Haven does not make front page news. We have Yale at the center of town. I don't know how many of you heard the news last year when there was a young woman who was killed. She was murdered, I believe, in the chemistry department. It was on the news for 3 weeks easily. Meanwhile, you have, you know, scores of young people who die in New Haven and who just go unreported and unwitnessed in that way. And so what these communities have done is they've created their own ways of bearing witness, and they'll put the faces of the one who's been shot or killed on a button, and each person who knows them will wear this button for about a week. And that's a silent vigil that takes place. So taking up on that idea and taking up on this idea that students and that youth have wanted to find a way of bearing witness to the names of the people that have been lost, we created a wall, a mourning wall. We called it the Lost and Found Memorial Wall, and invited students to make paper roses, put it up on the wall where there was a number of instruction paper sheets, and they would write down a message to somebody that they had lost. We started with 9 pieces of construction paper on the wall, and by the end of the day, actually by the end of the 3 hours that we had there as part of the health fair that the school was running, the wall was covered from one wall to the other. So there were at least, I'd say about maybe 60, 70 sheets of paper up on the wall, each covered with a variety of different names and roses. And asking students that went by what they felt or what they thought, student remarked that it was the roses that initially caught her attention, and that if it wasn't for the roses, she would have found the entire thing really sad, and it would have been hard to tolerate being up close to this wall where her peers were putting up the names of people who had been lost. And it really got me reflecting on the power of aesthetics and the power of metaphor and the power of beauty in helping us to sit with suffering. So that's one example. There are some other ones that I'd like to share with you, but given this sort of new format that we're working with just audio and the fact that I don't have pictures.
I wanted to let you know, Nisha, that actually people can see the slides.
They can?
Cool. They can see them now.
Okay, you're at the memorial wall?
You won't be able to scroll through them because you can't see them on your end, but I'm listening to your cues and I'm moving things along here.
Perfect.
So now I've put it on the Living Histories.
Beautiful. Okay, so the Living Histories Ensemble is a group of actors who do a form of theater called playback theater, which some of you might be familiar with. It's a kind of theater in which a group of actors transform audience member stories on the spot into art, into living theater, using dance, using script, using words, using poetry on the spot, translating lived experience into art. And we've been using playback theater within the Montreal Life Stories Project. I've included links to each of the projects I mentioned, either on the slide itself or at the end of the presentation, so that you can look it up more if you're interested. Essentially, the Montreal Life Stories Project seeks to archive 500 stories of Montrealers who've been displaced as a result of genocide, war, or human rights violations. And there are a number of different working groups that come together in this project, a Rwandan group, a Cambodian working group, an education group, a performance group, and so on. And so in this particular picture that you're seeing, is taken from one of our performances, of course, and you'll see the quote on the side is by a woman who was actually at one of the performances that we did for the Rwandan commemoration of the genocide this past, the Rwandan genocide, which was in 1994. There was a commemoration that took place this past year that we performed at, and one of the women had remarked how this kind of gathering permitted a sharing of lived experience, a sharing of stories. And it got me thinking about, okay, well, so that's happening. We could sit together and have a conversation about our lived experience and our stories as well. Is there something that's gained by translating our stories through this artistic medium? And asking audience members further about that, a number of them said, well, it gives us pause, it slows things down, it makes it tolerable, it opens up new perspectives because they might see something in a reenactment that highlights some aspect of their experience that they did mention. And, the artist may get it wrong as well. We may, not completely meet the teller, meet the audience member where their experience was at. And again, that offers them an opportunity to clarify, no, this is actually what I meant, this is actually what I felt. That's the Living Histories Ensemble. I think the next slide is one of Rhodesworth. Is that?
Yes, it is.
So Rhodesworth is another Montreal artist, and I included this one in here. His art isn't necessarily in response to the kind of devastating suffering that I've been describing up to now, but maybe you could argue that. He was really working hard against, and I think he's still there and still doing this kind of work, working against a consumer culture and a car culture and trying to promote a lifestyle that involves slowing down, cycling, walking. And what he would do is he would create these random bike paths throughout the city. And they wouldn't just be any bike paths. I think in the picture you see that it looks more like a zipper. Also done other ones where he's just taken bike paths that exist already in the city and he extends them. Now, Rhodesworth, or Peter Gibson, which is his real name, has been arrested a number of times for this. So I'm not necessarily condoning it, but at the same time, risk nothing, gain nothing. His work has gained attention, and he has been able to take his work to new levels as a result of being committed to this kind of work. Rhodesworth, and I think the last slide there is of V-Day, which I mentioned earlier. I just included the slide in here so you'd have it as a resource. And for that, you should see a slide that opens up a few questions. Is that right? Or do you have the Creative Arts Therapy slide there, Elvira?
It's actually the Creative Arts Therapy slide.
Perfect. Okay, perfect. I'm going to move quickly through these. So as I was mentioning, there are times where somebody needs more professional help or more support than what they're getting from collaborative or community-based initiatives. And sometimes that's indicated because the symptoms that they've been living have just persisted for too long or are just interfering too much with their lives, with their relationships. And creative arts therapists, I noticed a number of you are creative arts therapists. I looked at the list of attendees earlier, and so I know you'll be able to speak more to this when we get into conversation. But creative arts therapy includes dance movement therapy, drama therapy, art therapy, poetry therapy, psychodrama, sand play, art therapy. It's essentially the use, the intentional and systematic use of the arts in a therapeutic process to facilitate therapeutic outcomes. And by therapeutic outcomes, I mean very much what I was referring to earlier in terms of opening up perspective, facilitating communication, but does so in a more intimate and intentional way. So how does trauma, especially how do the beliefs that are produced as a result of trauma interfere with the choices that a person feels that they can make? Creative arts therapies in relationship to trauma can be very helpful in, one, identifying what's happened, symbolizing the effects, and being able to challenge some of the thoughts that arise in a person's present-day experience. Now, that sounds a lot like typical psychotherapy, and so what do the arts specifically add to the therapeutic process? Well, sometimes, and I've mentioned this earlier, trauma defies understanding. And because it defies understanding, because it's a senseless kind of experience, it can often elude words. Sometimes it's hard to put words to very, very difficult experiences, and movement and art and drama and dance can stitch together or bring together our senses in a way that permit us to express experiences that are complex and that are fragmented, because trauma does fragment our sense of cohesiveness in the world. There's definitely more to say there. I've included some resources at the end about creative arts therapies. I'm going to stop. There's another slide that if you click Elvira one forward, there's a slide that talks a little bit about the differences in using creative arts therapies for children versus adults who've gone through traumatic experiences. Mm-hmm. And so I'll leave that there, and then we're going to move forward into some questions.
Just pull up here, actually, the slide on the questions arising from practice.
Yeah.
I want to maybe highlight some of those.
Yeah. So I put a number of different questions down, and you will have heard me sort of question my practice throughout this presentation so far. One, a big question that comes up often in my work is, what does it mean to signify something as trauma? Does that section it off too much as something that only happens to a particular kind of people or a group of people? Does it give community artists some kind of currency when they say, their work is dealing with trauma? Does it authenticate or authorize their work in a way that's helpful or in a way that fetishizes trauma? When I was talking about the Living Histories Ensemble, a question that really came to mind was, so what aesthetics, what does beauty bring to reception? What does it bring to being able to share stories of suffering and pain in a community context? How does it help us tolerate suffering or live alongside it, given that we're not going to be able to get rid of suffering, the big S, big suffering, anytime soon? It's with us. It's part of the human condition, and at the same time, trauma, specific events of trauma or specific kinds of trauma are definitely something that we work hard to eradicate. And there's another question that comes to mind around voyeurism. Sometimes people who participate in especially in community arts projects that deal with trauma talk about a sense of voyeurism that they feel. There's a lot of feelings that are shared. People get very emotional. And how okay are we with emotion shared in public? Or are those things always something that has to be reserved for the private space of therapy? Questions that come up in terms of my clinical work have to do with how do we link up the private work of therapy with ongoing social movements that don't see rape, for example, as an individualized experience, but as part of a larger epidemic affecting everybody, really, because it permits a gender inequity and a violent boundary that maintains that gender inequity.
I just wanted to sort of pick up where you sort of left off, and you're sort of positioning the presentation in terms of arts therapy, and that brings to mind sort of therapy for the individual, but you've also mentioned a lot about sort of the collective creative art therapy as a collective practice. I'm wondering if you experience sort of a different approach for different audiences, if you will, or if most of the work that you've done is more for the collective.
It's definitely both. I mean, I used to only ever work with groups and with community organizations until I started to become very interested in when though that work isn't enough, and when people suffering needed more attention. So I became more interested in psychology and became a creative arts therapist, became a drama therapist, and now my work on the clinical side is with individuals, with couples, with families, and with groups that have a stake with one another. Their relationships matter to them, and they need to negotiate something together. So both. So I work in a collective way and also with individuals.
And I assume for the individual perspective, the objectives are going to be different. They're going to be about individual healing, whereas for the collective, part of the objectives could be healing. The other part could be what you mentioned earlier, more influencing social policy. It's about also putting into public spaces something that you mentioned is often or sometimes sort of unexpressed or silenced or doesn't have a voice.
Sure. And also if you're doing something in a public, in a public way or with a community, it's you don't often have the same information. I mean, you may that all of them are dealing with an AIDS epidemic, for example, but you may not know their individual family histories and what shapes their choices that they make as they try to participate in the community collaborative piece, for example. So, if I'm sitting with an individual in a clinical frame, I'm able to take that time. So the timeline differs as well. What I'm able to do with somebody in a clinical context versus in a non-clinical context, what accountability I have to them. I mean, I'm accountable in both cases, but the legalities are different, and to some extent the ethics are, I don't want to say they're entirely different. The ethics, actually, we have a whole other webinar on the ethics of community engaged practice. They're definitely very similar, but there are ethical contracts that we sign when we or a code of conduct that we adhere to when we're working in a clinical sense, and there'll be one for community engagement as well.
You know what? We have a question from Logan Haney, and Logan says, I work at a rape sexual assault crisis center as an outreach worker. How can I bring this more into my work and use it to facilitate to First Nations communities?
I haven't. I'm wondering if it's possible to share emails at all, Elvira. Maybe we could talk about that later. I have an excellent article that Logan might enjoy, that you might enjoy, Logan, by a colleague of mine, Lucy Liu, who works at the Minishkawan Lodge in Ottawa. She just recently wrote an article on decolonizing art therapy practice. What she talks about is, well, for one, she positions herself as a circle keeper, and she's an art therapy process where the women at her center drew body maps, and on those body maps wrote down or drew symbols that represented the strengths that they had in their bodies, and also parts of their bodies that were wounded or hurt, and then would use body maps in a circle and talk about the stories that came out of them. So it wasn't an open-ended process. It was the same group of women for a period of time that she met with. But that was a really interesting project. I mean, other things that a person can do when they're in crisis is, you can invite somebody in the rape crisis shelter where you are. You can invite people that you meet with to, if they can't tell you, to show you what they get filled up with. What is the feeling that they're walking in with? What color would they choose to represent that feeling? And here I'm talking about the simple use of the arts to as a projective device to jumpstart conversation, or to enter into nuances of a person's experience that they may not initially have words for. But if you put it out there, if you externalize it through an arts-based project, process, they might have they may be able to use it to facilitate their ability to talk to you.
People are really excited to hear more about that piece, and I'm going to share with them the link. I'm going to send them the link. Lucy Liu has sent us her email address, and Logan definitely wants to get a copy of the article, so everyone really appreciates that. Do you want to speak more to some of the questions arising from practice that you've raised? You raised in the slides, and just a little bit more about some of the different kinds of experiences that you've had. I know you may be referring to the Montreal Life Histories Project. I know that was a project that involved many different aspects and working with many different communities. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I'd be happy to. I'm wondering if there are any other questions right now.
I'm waiting for questions to come in.
Okay. All right. Terrific. I did. So let's see. So in terms of the Montreal Life Stories Project, is Lucy Liu one of our attendees right now?
She is.
That is fantastic. So Lucy Liu is part of the Living Histories Ensemble as well, and so we've been working together over the last 5 years, working with different communities in Montreal, and they're actually going to be joining me here in New Haven in 2 weeks. To expand our work to the larger playback theater community, because something that we've been experimenting with in our work is typically playback theater involves the sharing of life stories and creating artwork creating theater in the moment in response to that. What it doesn't do is it does allow the audience to get a sense of what the artists or what the visual artists are thinking or feeling as they listen to the stories that are being told by audience members. So it sort of keeps the actors neutral, and it keeps their lived experiences and their histories secret. So what we've been experimenting with is how to make our own social location, our assumptions, and our biases more transparent in our work, which is, I think, something, if I were to create a code of ethics for community-engaged arts practice, I would put that up there, that, the community-engaged arts practitioner needs to find ways of entering into a shared conversation. In oral history practice, we call that shared authority, so that there is an equal risk to the extent possible being taken.
I'm also wondering, this is just something that I was thinking of as you were speaking. You talked a little bit about how creative art therapy is received from, let's say, from the therapeutic. I'm not sure how to name the field, but basically the field of practitioners who work in implementing therapies. But I'm wondering how it's been received from the arts community itself. Is it seen as a separate practice? Is it seen as something in between? How is it received?
That's a great question. Arts therapies really fall between two disciplines, or the perception that there are two disciplines of art and health or mental health, and so we sort of find ourselves navigating this third space between two, which can be really exciting, but it can also be really frustrating when it comes to applying for grants or for funds from funding bodies that don't quite understand that there's this hybrid practice that brings together the learning and the wisdom from both fields. So it's a real space of possibility, but can also create some challenges.
Actually, segueing into that, Logan asked the question: where do we find creative art therapies, ideas, projects? Do they have? Can you be trained for this? Might be a good moment to lead into the resource slide, which maybe will give people some ideas. Do you want to speak a little bit more to that?
There's also a slide in there that mentions at least 4 creative arts therapies projects, 3 or 4 of them. Do you see that one there? I think it's right before the resource slide. Healing the Wounds of History, The Hidden Face of Suicide, Pandora's Project. Right. So those are a few projects that are ongoing and that are done sometimes in the private sphere, sometimes in the public sphere, or they have films or documents that have been created, archives that have been created from therapeutic processes so that you can learn more about it. Resources page, if you click to that last page there is also a list of resources, websites that you can go to find more information about either the creative arts therapies and also about community-engaged arts practice. The one that I would highlight is the Levier Foundation in the last section there of resources. They have a great resource list. These websites, if you go to their links and resources, you'll find a lot of really pertinent, interesting information.
So let's say if you're someone who has experienced trauma on an individual level, or you're a member of community that has experienced collective trauma, but you don't necessarily have experience in creative art therapy, would you suggest that they read up on it and they just sort of jump right in and practice some of these techniques, or do you suggest that they partner with someone with experience? How would someone approach this if they're interested in it, but they haven't necessarily had any experience?
And you're saying somebody who's actually been through or is going through trauma and seeking help?
Yeah, I'm thinking about a way, how do they transform the experience into something positive or something creative, or looking for a vehicle for expression, and think that this might be an option, either individual or community level. Yeah,
it's some communities will. Well before there were doctors and mental health practitioners, the body and the spirit and the mind would heal when it was, when it was wounded. So people don't necessarily seek out professional help as part of their journey towards healing. Sometimes others in their family and friends might say, hey, maybe it's time to see somebody else who can support you in this because the situation calls for it. In terms of somebody choosing a creative arts therapist, they would need to do a little bit of research into the creative arts therapies. For example, if somebody presents themselves at a university health center and they're seeking psychotherapy services. I know that, for example, at Concordia University in Montreal, they would provide a pamphlet that had a number of different kinds of therapies listed on it. And there are alternative therapies that would be creative arts therapies. With any therapist that somebody would choose to see, they would need to verify their credentials, verify that they're part of a professional organization, and essentially get to know whether that kind of work meets them where they need to be met. If it's not clinical work that they're looking for, and they're interested in doing something collaborative and community-minded with friends or family or with the community that's going through something, then they may well come up with the ideas themselves, or they could probably look up any of these resources and get in touch with other people who've done similar work and consult with them. That's organically usually how it happens.
Here's a testimonial actually speaking to that. Elise writes, I work as an expressive arts facilitator and have found that expressive arts activities have really helped my clients express themselves. I'm not a therapist, but the work is therapeutic. I did my training at Fleming College in Halliburton School of Arts. So I think that speaks very nicely to
terrific.
To your
Absolutely.
And I'm very conscious of the time, Nisha, and it's 12:57, and I know that some people might be on their lunch hours. So I wanted to thank you very much, and to thank you very much, and also to thank all of the attendees very much, and also for their patience in bearing with us through some of the technical glitches. And I did notice that everyone stayed on very attentively. So I think that also speaks to the very compelling nature of your work, Nisha. I want to spend just the last minute just wrapping things up and letting people know that, as I mentioned at the top, this webinar series is being presented as part of the Light a Spark campaign. If you want to know a little bit more about our campaign, please, I welcome you to follow the link that you see on your screens, girlsactionfoundation.ca/lightaspark, and you'll find out other ways that you can get involved, including following some more webinars. Today's, we have one more coming up in June, and then the series continues in the fall. You could also, of course, help spread the word about inspiring women and the work that they're doing by liking our Facebook page, and also just checking out our website. And I'm sure that you're going to find lots of stories that resonate. Here I've pulled up the next webinar, which is on a very, very completely different subject. It's about keeping it real in the music industry, or women in the music industry. I do also want to let you know that today's, at the end of this session, you will be receiving a short survey that's going to pop up on your screen, and we really appreciate feedback. So I would really welcome you to complete the survey and to send that to us. And that's it for me. I wanted to reinforce the fact that I'm putting back the resources page, and that these resources will be made available to everyone, as well as some of the links. One person had written in that they wanted to have another glance at the Arise slides. So I'm just going to pull that up again really quickly, and ask you, Nisha, if you wanted to wrap things up, if you have something.
Sure, absolutely. I would really, if people have time and are interested, I would encourage you to go to the Creative Alternatives page that's on Facebook, and you'll see a link to this webinar, and underneath it, of course, there will be a comment box, and we can continue the conversation there. Please feel free to drop me a line anytime, share resources. I'd be happy to continue the conversation with any one of you, and thank you so much for your staying on board with our, as Elvira said, with our technical glitches. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.